Hello, everyone. In this session, we will be talking about disability, neurodiversity, and inclusion. We will be reframing disability from individual deficit to organizational responsibility. Our goal today is to shift our view of disability from a deficit based lens and instead examine how systems, environments, and professional norms shape inclusion or exclusion, often unintentionally. We will focus particularly on child and family serving contexts, where narrow developmental norms and behavioral interpretations can result in oversurveillance, mislabeling, and exclusion, especially for racialized, immigrant, and faith based communities. Hopefully, by the end of this session, we'll start seeing disability and neurodiversity as natural and valuable forms of human diversity that need to be structurally accommodated, as opposed to individual deficits. Framing disability and neurodiversity. Traditionally, disability has been understood through a medical model, which focuses on diagnosis, impairment, and fixing the individual. While medical care can be important, this model often positions disability as a problem located entirely within a person. In contrast, disability scholarship emphasizes the social model of disability, which argues that people are disabled primarily by environmental, institutional, and attitudinal barriers rather than by their bodies or minds alone. For example, a child who processes information differently is not inherently excluded, but becomes excluded when systems only recognize one way of communicating, learning, or behaving. Neurodiversity builds on this perspective by recognizing neurological differences, such as autism, ADHD, and learning differences, as natural variations in human cognition, rather than deficits or disorders to be corrected. From a DEI perspective, disability and neurodiversity are therefore equity issues, not individual limitations. Inclusion requires systems to adapt, not individuals to constantly compensate. Ableism and systemic barriers. Ableism refers to the systemic privileging of non disabled bodies and minds, and the assumption that certain ways of thinking, communicating, or functioning are inherently superior. In organizations, ableism often appears quietly. It shows up in rigid policies, standardized expectations, productivity norms, and professional language that frames difference as risk, noncompliance, or deficiency. Research shows that these dynamics are intensified through intersectionality. Disabled individuals who are also racialized, immigrants, low income, or members of religious minorities often experience compounded surveillance and exclusion. In child and family serving contexts specifically, neurodivergent children are more likely to be misinterpreted, over-monitored, or disciplined when behavior is assessed through narrow or culturally biased norms rather than contextual understanding. This is particularly critical for MCAS, as vulnerable children represent the organization's primary service population. Models of disability. There are originally two main models of disability, the medical model and the social model. The medical model understands disability primarily as a condition located within the individual. It focuses on diagnosis, impairment, and remediation, often framing disability as something that needs to be corrected, managed, or cured. Within this framework, professionals tend to ask, what is wrong with the person, and how can we fix it? While medical care and diagnosis can be important for access to supports and services, the medical model can unintentionally reduce individuals to their impairments. In child and family serving contexts, this model can lead to labeling behaviors as deficits rather than exploring environmental, cultural, or systemic factors contributing to challenges. The social model shifts the focus away from the individual and towards society. It argues that people are disabled not primarily by their bodies or minds, but by barriers in environments, policies, attitudes, and systems. It identifies disabling barriers within environments and systems. The social model reframes disability as a matter of justice and accessibility rather than personal tragedy. However, some critiques note that while it addresses structural barriers, it may not fully engage with identity, intersectionality, or lived experience. When we think about disability or neurodiversity, whose responsibility do we usually assume it is to adapt, the individual or the organization? What research consistently shows is that what we often label as challenging behavior is frequently a signal of unmet needs rather than intentional defiance. Inclusive practice begins when systems respond with curiosity, flexibility, and partnership rather than control in an attempt to change behavior. Let's discuss how a DEI-informed approach would go about this. A DEI-informed approach builds upon the social model by integrating equity, dignity, intersectionality, and rights-based inclusion. This model emphasizes that people are not disabled by their bodies or minds, but by inaccessible systems. It recognizes that equity requires proactive system design, not simply responding to accommodation requests. Lastly, it emphasizes that inclusion is sustainable only when embedded in governance, policy, and organizational culture. This brings us to our next point: inclusive practice and accommodation. Inclusive practice is grounded in the understanding that accessibility and accommodation are organizational responsibilities, not personal favors. Accommodations are practical supports used to reduce or remove systemic barriers. They are not special privileges, but mechanisms that help ensure fair access and participation. Research on inclusion consistently shows that when inclusion is not embedded structurally through policy, leadership accountability, and organizational design, it becomes fragile and dependent on an individual goodwill, which means inclusion must be embedded structurally through policy and leadership in order to avoid this fragility. An example of this would include a formal accessibility and inclusion policy in the organization's governance documents that requires translation or interpretation services for those who are deaf, hard of hearing, or those who do not speak English, for example. Building on the DEI informed approach, we now turn to a practical framework that demonstrates how equity and inclusion can be embedded directly into environments and systems. Universal design. Universal design is an approach to designing environments, programs, services, and systems so that they are usable by the widest possible range of people without needing to make changes later or rely only on individual accommodation requests. The key idea behind this design is that human diversity is normal. People differ in how they move, communicate, learn, process information, manage sensory input, and access systems. This framework starts from the assumption that these differences will exist and that our systems should be built with that in mind from the beginning. Traditionally, many organizations have approached accessibility in a reactive way. This means barriers are addressed only after someone discloses a disability and asks for the accommodation. Universal design takes a different approach. It encourages us to anticipate difference and design flexibility into systems from the start, rather than placing the burden on individuals to advocate for access. This matters from a DEI perspective because relying only on accommodations can unintentionally reinforce power imbalances. It assumes that people must name their disability, justify their needs, and navigate systems that were not designed with them in mind. Universal design reduces that burden by making inclusion the default rather than the exception. This approach aligns with MCAS's vision and values of helping vulnerable families, making inclusion the default rather than the exception. Universal design is guided by 7 core principles that help us think practically about inclusion. I'll briefly walk us through each one. The first principle is equitable use. This means designing systems that are usable by people with diverse abilities in ways that do not stigmatize or segregate anyone. The second principle is flexibility in use. This means allowing different ways for people to participate, communicate, or engage, recognizing that there is no single right way for everyone. The third principle is simple and intuitive use. This means making systems easy to understand, regardless of someone's experience level, language proficiency, or cognitive ability. The fourth principle is perceptible information. This means sharing information in multiple ways, for example, verbally and in writing, so that people with different sensory needs can access it. The fifth principle is tolerance for error. This means designing systems that minimize harm when mistakes happen, recognizes that errors are part of being human. The sixth principle is low physical effort. This means systems should be usable comfortably without unnecessary physical strain or fatigue. And the seventh principle is size and space for approach and use. This means providing adequate space and layout so people with different mobility needs, body sizes, or assistive devices can fully participate. It is important now to distinguish universal design from individual accommodation. Accommodations are individualized adjustments made after a barrier is identified. Universal design, on the other hand, aims to reduce the need for accommodations altogether by removing barriers before they arise. For example, offering plain language materials supports people with cognitive disabilities, but it also benefits people learning a new language, youth, and families under stress. Offering flexible meeting formats such as virtual options or recorded sessions supports people with disabilities, caregivers, and those facing transportation barriers. In this way, universal design doesn't only benefit people with disabilities, it improves access and participation for everyone. At MCAS, we use a variety of different platforms of communication, for example, such as email, WhatsApp, Zoom, etc., to ensure that everyone can access information and stay connected with one another. Sustainability and organizational responsibility. In organizations like MCAS, universal design is vital. Systems with limited or rigid norms can unintentionally exclude diverse children and families. This is especially crucial when we consider our target population that includes a lot of children from diverse ethnic backgrounds, and thus experiences that could greatly impact behavior, growth patterns, and any other differences. Universal design supports equity by reducing the need for disclosure, supports dignity by avoiding special treatment, and supports trust by creating environments where people don't have to fight to be included. Sustainable inclusion requires policies, governance structures, and accountability mechanisms, as well as resourcing that actively support accessibility and participation. Now, as our workshop comes to an end, I want to take a moment to say that our journey towards inclusion requires a fundamental shift in perspective and practice. We have to move from deficit to diversity, recognize that disability and neurodiversity are natural human variations and not impairments to be fixed. We move from accommodation to design by prioritizing proactive universal design to remove barriers before they arise, benefiting everyone, and from burden to collective duty by understanding that fostering inclusion is a shared organizational and individual responsibility embedded in culture and policy. Inclusion is not about fitting people into systems, it's about transforming systems to honor dignity, participation, and human diversity. Thank you guys for listening. I want to leave us with a reflection and mention that systematic change does not happen overnight. It requires a lot of deliberation as well as research. I want us to take a few minutes to reflect on the couple questions that are written down.